and off, right? This way.
Speak.
Bismillah. Bismillah.
No, no. Speak.
Bismillah. Bismillah. Could you hear it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. خلاص.
More on.
Bismillah. Bismillah. Okay. Yes.
End of a very extensive 3 days. Thank you all and have a safe trip back home. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On behalf of my colleagues and Saph members, I welcome you to the 13th annual meeting.
Welcome to our 11th Saph meeting. Saph is the Saudi Association for Pulmonary Hypertension. It's a specialized group of elite physicians in Saudi Arabia and including some of the Gulf region.
This is part of the Saudi Association for Pulmonary Hypertension meeting, SAF 2018, that was just held here in Dubai in April 2018. It's been actually a great meeting. I've had a chance to interact with some of the leaders in the field.
Every year this Congress is providing the best possible knowledge and evidence for the different treatments in any area, including drugs, including interventional procedures, and including also surgical procedures.
Saph family for many years now. I like to come to this conference year by year. And the organization, as usual, is perfect, and the quality of the scientific program is outstanding.
We have more than 500 patients included in this different trial, meaning a lot of small trials, and we have the air study that are nicely showed in the previous meeting.
We're grouping many people from different countries, and from Europe, from the US, and from Saudi Arabia, and Dubai, and many other countries.
Many colleagues that really worked very well. From the international speaker, I really need to say that the PBRI had a great role in Saph's success. So I'd like to have basically special thanks.
Where you can meet all the experts in the field, get all the updates, and get to know your colleagues and mingle with them. Saph is an amazing team, which we are really proud of, and I hope it will continue for years and years to come.
وارتفاع ضغط الدم داخل شرايين الرئة وليس الضغط العام. وبما أن يرتفع ضغط الدم داخل شرايين الرئة والقلب تدفق الدم من الجهة اليمنى من القلب يدخل الرئة. وإذا كان هناك ضغط عالي في شرايين الرئة يأثر على عضلات القلب بالذات الجهة اليمنى مع الوقت.
نعم ممتاز. طيب هل هو يعتبر مثل ما ذكرت في البداية أنه هل هو مرض نادر وهل تشخيصه سهل؟ وبرضه يا دكتور يعني كيف تشوف طريقة علاجه؟
هو طبعا نادر لكن لها أسباب كثيرة، بعضها شائع وبعضها نادر، وهو يصنف إلى عدة مجاميع. هناك ما تسمى المجموعة الأولى وهذه هي اللي نادرة، وعادة يعني بالطروحات والنشرات العلمية تقريبا بين 50 إلى 100 كل مليون يصابون في هذا المرض. وهو طبعا بحكم انه نادر وبالتالي يكون تشخيصه في العاده صعب شويه، وعاده التشخيص يعني يتولى عمليه فرز اسباب المرض، لانه هو صحيح المحصله هو ارتفاع ضغط الشرايين الرئوي المحصله النهائيه، ولكن لها عده اسباب. فدقه التشخيص تكمن في فرز هذه الاسباب، وبالتالي وصول التشخيص الدقيق، وبالتالي ايضا العلاج الدقيق، لان لكل مرض لكل سبب من هذه الاسباب علاج خاص.
اي شغل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Good evening everyone and welcome to Saph 2022. I would like to call our chairs for tonight to move to the stage, please. Before you sit, Dr. Abdullah Dalan, you can maybe move forward and start your welcome notes for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hassan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everybody to Saph 2022. It has been long since we met. Saph, can you turn off this one, please? Saph has been growing over the years, and this is our 15th annual meeting. There has been a significant growth over the last several years in terms of number of participants and number of activities, as well as number of speakers who normally attend our general annual scientific meetings. We have also been doing master classes, workshops, and many other activities, both locally and internationally. While waiting for my slides, this is our first physical meeting since the pandemic started. Our last meeting was 2021 was virtual. The one before that, Luke always reminded me that his last flight was to Saph 2020 in Riyadh, and his first flight coming back attending the first physical meeting is actually Saph 2022 in Jeddah. So I know many people are actually eager and happy to finally attend physical meetings and interact with colleagues. And it is really our pleasure to welcome you all. I think we can share a few slides with you about our activities in Saph, and we'll go over the scientific program quickly, and then we'll give the stage for our two speakers. Sure, no problem. This year, the scientific program, it has been a tradition over the last several years that the first night normally is actually only two long talks. One is a keynote speech, normally 45 minutes, and the other one is a clinical year review in PH, in pulmonary hypertension in general. And then the second day is a full program. The third day is a half-day program. And that normally covers all aspects of pulmonary hypertension. We also have normally a session for challenging cases from real life practice, and these are actually presented by different colleagues from different centers, whether in Saudi Arabia or even outside. This year, our registration number has been strikingly high. In fact, the total number of registration this year is 12,800 people. So this has never happened even in general pulmonary meetings, including Gulf Thoracic. And this indicates two things. I look at it this way. One is that there are many people who are generating interest in the pulmonary hypertension in general, pulmonary hypertension knowledge, diagnosis, treatment. And the other thing is that many people are actually eager to attend the conferences since it has been long since the pandemic started. We are expecting a good number of attendees, inshallah, starting from tomorrow. The first night normally is a keynote speech, and normally it's related somehow to pulmonary hypertension. This year, however, has been a little bit of a change. We choose to talk about the pandemic because this is the matter of the hour. So it's again, it's a pandemic thing, but it's related to respiratory medicine in general. So in a way, it's linked to pulmonary in general. And I think the slides will take longer time, but I'm truly happy to tell you that there has been a very good growth of number of attendees. We started a long time ago, started about 15 years ago, but the data we have actually from 4 or 5 years ago. But anyway, Saph 20, okay. So Saph 2018 has been attended by about 162. And normally in PH in general, whether here or internationally, the total number of attendees, because it's an orphan disease, is around 150, 200, 100 or so. But Saph normally has been well attended, and the growth is actually happening very dramatically. The last year we did it virtually. There was 5,300 plus attendees, and that was virtual. And we understand that people can attend from everywhere. But to our surprise, this year the registration was 12,820, and this is surprisingly high. But we are all happy that that Saph has this momentum among physicians in the country. And by the way, it's not only in Saudi Arabia, across the globe, but mostly from the Middle East and South Asia. Recently, Saph launched. Of course, Saph has been doing annual conferences, master classes, awareness days, workshops, and that has been mostly in the kingdom, in Saudi Arabia. Recently, we thought to start what we call it now international outreach program, and it has many activities. The first one we started this year with the Egyptian Society, and the main aim is to do some sort of partnership with the local societies of our neighboring countries, not even neighboring countries, even as far as Malaysia, for instance. And do with them some sort of activities, whether it's not limited to, but this is what we are thinking to do: conferences, symposia, workshops, master classes, joint research, and some sort of exchange visitor from countries to our centers in the country. I think what we did this year was very successful in Egypt, and the first one was done I think a month ago or 6 weeks ago. It was very well received by our colleagues from Egypt. It was also attended by several people from the neighboring Arab countries, from Libya and other countries. Let me start now thanking my colleagues in the scientific committee, headed by Dr. Omar Tamimi, who is not here because he got sick the last minute, and he sent his picture on the bed, but he's doing well, alhamdulillah. So he couldn't make it. I'll chair the session for him. He was supposed to be chairing the session also this evening. These are all our colleagues, international and national speakers. I extend my thanks and gratitude to all of them. The first night, as I mentioned earlier, is only 2 long talks. It is now my pleasure to present and introduce my colleague and my friend, Professor Abdurrahman Rajhi. I think you all know him. Abdurrahman is going to talk about respiratory pandemics from the dark ages to the recent times. Dr. Rajhi graduated from Riyadh, but he did his postgrads in Harvard. He came back as a consultant infectious disease at King Faisal Specialist Hospital. He has been very well known from aspects of research activities as good clinicians as well, but also at a personal level. He has been also leading the Department of Medicine at some times. And he is now a member of the Shura Council, which is parliament and equal to parliament in other countries. Dr. Rajhi has been productive when it comes to research activities. He even published one randomized control study in New England Journal of Medicine. We are all happy to have Dr. Rajhi joining us to talk about respiratory pandemics throughout history in a conference of pulmonary hypertension. The podium is yours, Dr. Abdulrahman, please. قدام وراء.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Good evening, everyone. I'm really honored to be speaking tonight to this distinguished audience on a very interesting subject and actually what I call living history. The outline is basically we'll talk about pandemics and the concept and how this evolved in human history, and also get some examples about previous pandemics that afflicted humans and our current pandemic that we are all living in, and some notes about the future and what should we expect. Let me start by this quote from Sir William Osler. He says, "Humanity has but three great enemies: fever, famine, and war. Of these, by far the greatest, by far the most terrible, is fever." And if you really think of these three, they actually can cause each other sometimes, and unfortunately, they may be used during each other. So fever can be used in war and can result from war, as we will see. The reason I'm saying this is living history because we're actually having a novel and rapidly changing virus, and this hasn't been happening over the last, I would say, human history. We have exploding and dynamic data about what's happening currently. It's just amazing how much data are coming from all over the world. We have a pathogen-host interaction that is metamorphosing on the minute, changing everywhere by the same local and different locale and internationally. Unfortunately, what happened has explored or exposed an illogical human behavior, whether it's individual or groups. And I'm sure many of you have faced patients in clinic adamantly refusing to take the virus in spite of all our insistence and trying to explain the importance of that. There is never-ending uncertainty and unrelenting morbidity and mortality. People now thinking that Omicron is mild and we're not really seeing as bad disease as we used to see. Unfortunately, the numbers are not saying the same thing. Still, mortality is really very high by all standards. Conclusions, if any, are tentative and conditional and changing very quickly as we see the evidence evolving. And most alarmingly is that it seems that some societies and some, whether it's groups or communities, are not really learning from recent history as they should be, especially with the changes that we're facing with this epidemic or pandemic. So what is the concept of pandemic? How did it come actually? And the definition here comes from a dictionary of epidemiology. It's an epidemic occurring at a scale that crosses international boundaries. I'm not sure I could use the pointer here to use this hyperlink, but what I wanted to show here is basically that 20 years ago we had an outbreak that crossed international borders in at least 3 countries, which is the Rift Valley fever, and yet it is not considered as a pandemic. And the reason is that usually it affects people on worldwide scale. Unfortunately, that event with the Rift Valley fever did not really go beyond our region because of the strict and very quick control measures adopted at that time. Now, the epidemic, this is a technical definition from CDC, and it's basically the occurrence of more cases of disease, injury, or other health condition than expected in a given area or among a specific group of persons during a particular period. And if you notice here, they included things other than infections, things like injury, disease, and sometimes they use the terms of epidemic of smoking or epidemic of drug abuse and so on. So that really does not help our concept when we understand or hear the word pandemic, that it usually is an infectious process. So why are people shy of using the term pandemic? They are actually shy of using that. And if you look at, by the end of the 20th century, majority of very classical modern medical texts were not defining pandemic. They were even not including them in their indexes. Things like Institute of Medicine report on emerging infectious diseases. There is no mention of pandemic during that, in that text. So what is a pandemic? And it turns out that this is not I'm not the first one to pose this question. This was posed by actually Anthony Fauci and some of his colleagues, and now I'm sure everyone now worldwide and in the US knows Anthony Fauci. This was in 2009 when the epidemic of avian influenza was at that time evolving, and they argue in that editorial that the disagreement between taxonomists and epidemiologists and scientists and public health officials is not new, and they tried to actually put some grounds for defining a pandemic, and they thought that it has to be a wide geographic extension and has to have a disease movement moving from one area to the other or extending from one area to the other, high attack rates with explosiveness and infectiousness. So they really limited pandemics to infectious diseases rather than a pandemic of obesity, for example, or diabetes and so on. And contagiousness, where the disease is transmitted between humans without an intermediate host or a vector, and minimal population immunity. And we'll see how important this is in actually making the pandemics what they are. And also severity. So the disease has to have some severity and impact in the communities. For some reason, I like this slide. This shows basically on the x-axis the number of doctors, nurses, and midwives per 1,000 population. And on the y-axis, the DALYs per 1,000 population. DALYs are disability-adjusted life years. Basically, this is a measure of the disease burden on communities. And these are the world regions, and you could see on the far right, Europe has 32% of the manpower or the resources in terms of healthcare professionals globally, and they have almost 300 DALYs per 1,000 population, and almost 10 healthcare workers per 1,000 people. Compare that, for example, on the far left on the upper side. Here in sub-Saharan Africa, only 3% of the healthcare force is actually available there, in spite of DALYs being more than 600. And they have less than 2 healthcare workers per 1,000 population, sorry, per 1,000 population. If you look for our region, the Middle East, we have 6% of the workforce globally, and the average is around 2.2, but the DALYs are around 370. So when a global pandemic hits, the damage or the impact on communities will significantly be different based on resources and capabilities of facing this and the infrastructure they are having. So whatever is happening in a country that's reporting death and mortality and morbidity, people say that other countries are not facing the same thing, in fact, because of lack of reporting or documentation. So the impact is really major everywhere. So this is my take about pandemics. It's very simple terms. It has to be an infection. It has to be global epidemic. No one is safe, so it has the potential of afflicting everyone. And finally, it has to have a major impact. So something like, for example, acute hemorrhagic conjunctivitis, although it's an infection, it has an exploding spread. It doesn't really have major impact, so it should not be called a pandemic. The WHO and the pandemic has a very interesting story in 2009, and they were widely criticized for not calling influenza a pandemic first, and then when they did call it a pandemic, they were still widely criticized. And the interaction was mainly from media. I think it was a CNN reporter who was critiquing their website and definition of pandemic, and in their response, they said they really did not define pandemic, but rather they described it. So even at that time, there was no WHO definition about pandemics. So if you think of that, the pandemic actually until 2019 was only thought to be influenza. No one was considering or prepared to think of another pathogen causing a pandemic other than influenza until 2019. And in fact, in 2005, WHO introduced a 6-stage pre-pandemic pandemic staging system to address influenza. And that was very elaborate. It contained many preparatory stages and manuals, and had workshops and classes for different countries. And needless to say that very few public health officials in different countries were really prepared to or knew about this or even interested to start applying it or prepare for it. So these are some of the glimpses of how that stages were done, and you could see that it actually starts with a pre-endemic phase and then the pandemic itself. and then something like a post-pandemic or a recurrence. And this was used during the announcement in March 2020 when WHO announced a pandemic of global concern for COVID-19. So what determines the dynamics of pandemic is really societies, how dense they are, how their living circumstances are, the pathogen itself and its biology and novelty towards the immunity of the society itself. The travel, if the community is very enclosed or facing lots of people traveling, human and animal interaction, and altering ecosystems that we have been seeing globally over the last 50 years or so, and also transportation speed. And the example of the impact of transportation on pandemics, we'll see it in the different pandemics during the human history. The control is relatively simple and has been used actually a long time ago. It's quarantine and isolation, and the camel people in the Arabian desert were actually isolating diseased camel because they knew that this is an effective measure to control the spread of disease among their animals. Disinfection, pathogen-directed therapy, as we have used with influenza or with COVID, as we are trying now, and pathogen prevention by basically using vaccinations. So these are some of the past pandemics, and we'll talk about some of them, not all, plague, cholera, and tuberculosis. We'll not talk about AIDS. We'll talk about influenza, SARS, and MERS, and finally about SARS-CoV-2. There were 3 global pandemics, and they were followed by smaller local epidemics for plague. And the clinical forms of plague are, as you know, bubonic, which is basically the commonest and has a fatality rate between 50 and 90%. The septicemic, which is the least common, and this is universally fatal, and most likely results from either pneumonic or the bubonic, and the pneumonic, which is a fulminantly fatal disease. And the first one was actually in 541 AD, and was called Justinian plague. And Justinian was a Roman emperor. During his reign, the pandemic occurred and afflicted the East Roman Empire. And you could see the one in purple on the right side is the extension of the empire. Was famous for their paved roads where they actually were moving their arms and for commerce. And the disease was spreading across the roads, involving towns in all these roads. And in fact, this was the plague or ta'un that also killed several of the companions of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ when they arrived to the Levant in Sham during that period. And when it comes to number of mortalities in these historic things, it's very difficult to really be sure about the exact numbers. And you'd see the range very wide and sometimes very, very high. So this is a glimpse of how wide the range is for the first plague. And it's interesting to see the arts that have been associated with plague and other diseases, whether they are in the current literature or journals or in museums and so on. And it was thought to have originated from Egypt because of, again, grain coming from Egypt to the Roman Empire in Constantinople. But interestingly, recently with DNA analysis, people were excavating some of the skeletons in Euro-Asian steppe, and these were actually warriors from Mongolia who were coming to invade West. And when they died because of plague, they found out the Yersinia pestis is the same as that is exactly the same strain found in the Justinian plague period. The second one is more closely famous. It's the Black Death that actually devastated Europe and is originated in East Asia and swept across Central Asia to Europe. And again, it used the same Silk Road and caravan roads. And it killed as many as 30% of the European population. It lasted for almost 3 centuries. There has been successive waves of this plague. For example, the plague of Milan, the Great Plague of London, and the plague of Marseille. All of these were happening in different times, and it lasted for several years. This is, again, some of the graphs where they were actually counting mortality from these in, for example, areas. I think this was in London, in men and women, and you could see how it peaked during the month of September during that time. This is an interesting part of history. One of the small villages in northern England, I think, self-quarantined themselves, and they used this rock as a mark or a boundary, not allowing people to come in or leave. And these small holes were used to put vinegar in it and put coins, so the merchants will come and drop their merchandise and take money from these holes that are soaked with vinegar. They knew that this is, even before the germ theory of disease, they knew that vinegar and contamination can actually spread the disease. Now, the lineage of Yersinia pestis between these two plagues were actually independent emergencies. So it means that you can have a threat of having more and more of this if the circumstances allow. Now, the third one and the last one, as a major global one, happened in 1850 to 900, and it was that traveled from Europe to Asia and then actually spread in China, Hong Kong, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, India. And in fact, this was the time when Alexander Yersin discovered the bacteria, Yersinia pestis, in a specimen plague patients and did rats from Hong Kong. Now, what about plague now? Is it really a history? Is it gone? Unfortunately not. It's classified as a re-emerging infectious pathogen by WHO. There has been outbreaks in some countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, and Peru. And the last large outbreak was in Madagascar in 2017, where more than 2,000 victims were actually diagnosed to have a plague. Almost 3/4 of them were pneumonic. And the basic reproduction number, or R naught, was estimated to be 1.73. And the case fatality rate was as high as 8.6%. And this is in our age, in spite of ICUs, support, and antibiotics, still almost 8 or 9% of people will die from the disease. Yersinia pestis is very peculiar. It's a gram-negative rod. It's coccobacillus. It is susceptible to some antibiotics. There is a vaccine for it developed in the United States, and it's against only the bubonic plague, but not the pneumonic. And it's considered as category A, which means that it's easily disseminated and transmitted from person to person, with causing high mortality. And it has genetic plasticity, which means that it can acquire resistance to current antibiotics. And most alarming is that it can be aerosolized and used as a bioweapon. And there are certain considerations of some countries actually stockpiling this or considering this as a bioweapon because of its lethality and effect, especially the pneumonic type. There was an FDA-approved vaccine, and it's not really been used in civilian, except in labs and so on. And WHO has launched a program in 2018 trying to develop several plague vaccines. And they're really concerned about plague coming back to humanity. Just one slide about cholera. This is not really a respiratory pathogen, but it can be devastating, and we have seen it recently occurring with human disasters, whether it's an earthquake like in Haiti or wars like in Yemen and so on. And in 2019, almost 1 million cases of cholera were reported, with 1,900 deaths to WHO from 31 countries. So the potential of this coming up again at any time with human disasters, whether nature disaster or human-made, is quite possible. Influenza is the classical type of pandemic, and it's basically an RNA virus, has multiple structural proteins, and has hemagglutinin, neuraminidase, and nucleoprotein, and distinguished in types A, B, and C, and D. And the type A is the one that we are concerned about because it has potential to cause the pandemics, and it also infects animals and humans, including birds and pigs and horses and so on. And classically, it's a seasonal disease, so every year almost 3 to 5 million people would require hospital support with severe illness, with almost 500 deaths worldwide. What is peculiar about influenza is the antigenic shift resulting in emergence of a new virus subtype every time. And these gene reassortments can occur between humans and animal influenza A viruses, as we will see very soon. So the first pandemic may have occurred actually in 1510, but was not really well described. The first one is the Russian flu in 1800. It was well described with an R naught value of almost 2, with a case fatality ranging from 0.1 to 0.3. The devastating one that everyone knows about is the Spanish flu in 1918-1919. And it's an avian virus, H1N1, arose from genetic adaptation. It was an existing avian influenza that actually was sorted to become a new human virus, and that's why it was devastating because there was no immunity to the communities. Origin is unknown. It spread globally in 3 successive waves. People think it started from Spain because of the name, and interestingly, that's not the case. Spain was a neutral country during World War I, and they had a relatively free press, and they were talking about the mortalities of the flu, and they were reporting in their newspapers and so on. So they were more liberal in talking about it compared to other countries, and people were referring to the Spanish flu when it actually spread globally. These are the 3 waves that happened. You could see that the middle wave is the largest, and it actually arrived everywhere, even in this country here. It was called the Year of Mercy, Center Rahma, where almost every small town and village and rural area were affected by that. The R0 value is 2 to 3, and it's estimated that 500 million infections occurred with more than 50 million deaths, or 10% worldwide. Interestingly, some people are considering that in the US, for example, currently coronavirus mortality has exceeded the Spanish flu mortality in 1918. And it was a W-shaped mortality curve, which is very peculiar again, and you could see that probably this age group here has somehow were exposed to a similar strain of the virus that gave them some immunity, and that's why they are not dying. So it's young and old as usual, but this group in the middle here were actually, again, not immune against the specific strain. This is a table from WHO just listing how these successive waves of influenza, and they are really very related. We'll see now in a graph how they are coming after each other or from each other, and here has a description how they think they are either mild or relatively moderate and so on. And the Asian flu was a subtype of H2N2, and it was derived from the 1918 virus with acquisition of 3 new avian gene segments, and that's the peculiar thing. So this threat will continue coming with influenza and with coronavirus, where it actually can acquire new genes and become a totally new pathogen to non-immune humans. It originated in Hong Kong, then China, and the R0 value is 1.6 million were infected, and death were almost 13.13%. Here is the successive waves of the influenza pandemics, and you could see that they are really linked to each other from the first one. And even currently, as I hope many of you have received the influenza vaccine, it still contains parts of the H1N1 again, because you're trying to prevent this from coming back again. So WHO was formed in 1948 in April, and in 1952 they developed the Global Influenza Surveillance Network, trying to pick up because they were really concerned about the pandemic coming again. And they prepared their first plan in 1999, and the first flu vaccine was licensed for civilians in the US in 1945, and Dr. Salk was one of the lead researchers among that. Salk is for the polio Salk vaccine also, same thing. So the latest influenza pandemic was in 2009, and many of us remember that, and it was another peculiar reassortment of the genes originating from a human virus, an avian virus, and a swine virus. And it emerged in Mexico, but simultaneous outbreaks were in Mexico and southern United States, and the estimated R0 value is 1.5 almost, when case fatality is between 0.05 to 0.5. It is the first pandemic where a vaccine was effectively used along with antivirals to control it. And many of us remember when the dispute between countries on stockpiling antiviral treatment in spite of very poor evidence of its efficacy against influenza. Another peculiar influenza is the avian type, which is a highly pathogenic avian influenza. And this is the first human outbreak occurred in influenza A H5N1 in 1997. And it was documented in 17 countries with 861 cases, with case fatality more than 50%. Fortunately, this virus was not efficient in being transmitted between humans, and it actually was controlled very quickly with the control of the birds. So the influenza pandemic factors are like any other pandemic factors: transmissibility, virulence, and susceptibility of the population or their immunity. And this applies to also coronaviruses, which is the one we are facing currently. And this is an enveloped RNA virus. And there are 4 genera: alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And the it actually is known to cause common cold and gastroenteritis, alpha and beta, and some of the rapid antigen assays are also do pick some of the coronaviruses. The beta coronavirus recently has evolved into the severe diseases, which is the SARS, MERS, and SARS-2. Now the SARS, the first one, actually originated in Guangdong province in China 2003. Bats are the possible natural reservoir, and the palm civets could be the intermediary host before dissemination to humans. And this is the palm civets, and it's basically the wild palm cats. And for coffee lovers, these are the ones used to actually produce the kopi liwak, the most expensive coffee. They actually eat the cherries of the coffee, and then they collect their droplets and extract the beans from it. So during that outbreak, almost 8,500 cases were reported, with 813 fatalities from 29 countries. The case fatality rate was almost 10%. There's lots of nosocomial transmission and family transmission, and the R-naught value is almost 3. There was no therapy, no vaccine, but we were lucky because the virus has long incubation period, and it took 6 to 11 days to reach its peak viral load at that time. So after the onset of symptoms. So case identification, isolation, and contact tracing surveillance was very effective in actually aborting the pandemic after almost 7 months only. And unfortunately, still the SARS coronavirus-like viruses in bats are still around, and they've been shown to actually infect humans even without adaptation or any intermediate host. So the threat is still there, provided that the contact is made. MERS is ours. It originated in Saudi Arabia, and it's the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus in 2012. And bats are the possible natural reservoir, and camels are the intermediary hosts, as we all know. Has been many small outbreaks, including nosocomial transmissions. One of them was majorly in the city here in Jeddah. Many of us remember that. And the advances in molecular diagnostics and rapid next generation sequencing allowed identification of the virus very quickly. And between 2012 and 27 countries reported MERS-CoV, and almost 2,500 cases were reported, with 866 fatalities, unfortunately. There's very high fatality rate. Almost 1 out of 3 will die from MERS. The nosocomial transmission was quite significant. It's really a major threat to hospitals, and it reinforced the importance of infection control measures in hospitals in general. The R-naught value for it is 1. So again, there's no therapy, no vaccine, and lower R-naught. So no mitigation strategies were actually required except adopting strict infection control measures, and that alone was able to curb the pandemic in multiple areas. Unfortunately, MERS still circulates nowadays. It's ubiquity of infected animals in Saudi Arabia and other countries, and it's continuing zoonotic transmission. So the threat is there, and there has been intermittent sporadic cases that we see it in our practice, and God forbid, maybe also still outbreaks in hospitals. Finally, our current pandemic, the SARS-CoV-2, and this is the history that we're living. You all know that it started in Wuhan in China, and the bats are the possible natural reservoir, and the pangolins are the transmitting the virus as humans. And these are very cute, small ant-eating animals. They're used as fancy food, and they are actually bought and sold in wet markets in many countries. And during this pandemic, SARS can actually be asymptomatic in 40% of the patients. Global fatality really varies between areas to areas and depends on the denominator, which ones you count, but ranges from 0.25 to 3%. And the R-naught is dynamic and reported as high as 3%. I took this shot 2 days ago from the Hopkins site, and this morning in the news, I was using that in the US, the number actually exceeded 1 million fatalities. I'm not really sure about that. I double-checked in Hopkins, but it still was less than 1 million. Anyway, but the numbers are still staggering high, and if people think that Omicron is mild, look at the fatalities, weekly death from, this is the peak of the spike from Omicron. It's still really very, very high on the end, and the numbers of cases per week is extremely high. So Omicron clinically is mild on individual level, but at a community level, it's still causing major death and morbidity and mortality. SARS-CoV-2 is peculiar because it's novel, and it also has this infectious episode or period before symptoms onset. It's fortunate because we have extremely rapid diagnostics developed for it, and the vaccines were actually developed within less than a year, which is really remarkable. I mean, we're having the vaccine development, the trial, the efficacy, and so on. And the reason for that is because we were in the middle of an outbreak. So if you wanted to really enroll 40,000 people, you could do that in a week in a single city or country in the US, for example. So it wasn't difficult to actually prove the vaccine is effective. And antivirals, unfortunately, is not as successful. The combination of monoclonal antibodies were useful initially, but with the Omicron, it's again evading that, so it's not becoming not as effective. And more animals are discovered to be reservoirs, whether it's in Asia, the hamsters, whether it's in the US, the whitetail deers, and so on. And I think many of the other animals are reservoirs, and so SARS will remain with us. I don't think it will go away. And I think our children and maybe grandchildren will still receive the vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 in many, many years. Final word about Omicron, because it's the one that really swept the world very quickly. And I put this because it really is a reflection of what happens with pandemics. They are really shaped by the behavior of humans and pathogens. So we gave the virus the chance to develop into different variants or a variant of concern. Because we allowed it to replicate and we did not control it well initially. It was isolated from Africa in November 2021 and rapidly spread worldwide, and almost now it's the dominant strain all over the world. And I don't think any one of us has anyone in their families that did not get a house with a corona infection over the last couple of months here and everywhere. And it's more transmissible than Delta, 2 to 6-fold transmissible. It is raw virulence, but escapes immunity, whether it's vaccine-induced immunity or illness-induced immunity, and has a large genetic distance from the ancestral strain or any other variant of concern. And this is just a schematic presentation of how the virus actually is different. The wild type is the one on the left, the Delta is in the middle, and the red segment in the middle is the receptor binding domain, and you could see how many mutations are actually in Omicron. All of these are affecting the receptor domain, and that's why it's evading the monoclonal antibodies and immunity from vaccine or previous disease. So let me see a show of hands. Now, if we have a virus that's highly transmissible versus highly virulent, do you think a highly virulent virus is worse than a highly transmissible virus? Can I see a show of hands? Virulence. Who's for virulence? You think virulence is worse? Okay. So these are the people who think virulence is worse. Who think that transmissibility is worse? Okay, well, that's good. They almost double the number transmissibility. I'll just show you what exactly. We say this in a setting where the virus is novel in a community. And this is an example, a scenario that has been used by Adam Korashsky, I think from London School of Hygiene. And a community with 10,000 infections, and assume each new case will generate an average of 1.1, well, our value is 1.1 new cases, and around 0.8% new cases will result in death. In 1 month, you will have 129 deaths. Now, if we will manipulate the numbers, the R naught here will make it 50% higher, which is 1.15, or the fatality will make it 50% higher, which is 1.2%. So we'll start with the fatality. So this is a more virulent virus for the first group. It will result in 193 deaths in 1 month. But if you go to the transmissibility, these are the numbers. So you will have 978 deaths during the same period, only by increasing the transmissibility from 1.1 to 1.15, and more than 650% increase. And this is a representation different way, and unfortunately, the public health officials or the media and so on really do not appreciate the importance of exponentiality here. These segments are 6 days in between. This is the baseline strain, and this is 50% more fatal. It only continues 50%, but if it's 50% more transmissible, it's mild, but the total cumulative number will really be devastating to a community, as we have seen. This was an interesting editorial during the Delta variant in the US, and they were concerned about its R-naught value. And again, just to show you how significant the value is in impacting numbers, they were thinking it's between 5 and 8, and now Omicron is 6 times more transmissible than Delta. And here, if you have 10 cycles, you start with one case. If the R-naught value is 2.5, it will go down to almost 9,000, go up to 9,500 infections. If it's 6, it go down to 60. Still only 6 cycles. So that is how transmissibility is really extremely important in these situations. Another interesting editorial of history, this was Fauci talking about emerging infectious diseases, again addressing it to multiple presidents in the US, including, this was during the Zika origination, and at that time he used this slide showing that only one emerging disease in 1984, HIV, when he held office for the first time. And in 2017, these are the emerging infectious diseases that we are facing. So the ones in red, everyone in red here is an actual new emerging infection that's not been known before. And this is over 30 years or so. And the list will continue. It will not stop here. So what do we think about the future? This is the last slide, and I think this is not going to be the last pandemic. I think we'll see more of influenza and probably more of corona still, unfortunately. And human movement and material transfer will really have a major impact of it, and it's also impacted by the pandemic anyway. Disrupting more rural lands for development and agriculture, and again, we've seen this quite often in multiple areas, including in some of our small towns here, when they started having more agricultural projects and they got new infections that were not known before. More exposure to new pathogens from animal and environment, and never before global collaboration and transparency have been essential. It's really extremely important that we are literally one village in terms of human and pathogen movement. The boundaries and the political borders are meaningless in this time and age. And we have to trust systems, we have to trust scientists, we have to base policy based on science, not emotions or conflict of interest, as we have seen, unfortunately. And finally, we really have to nourish logical and human behavior, whether it's at local level or house or schools or communities and media and information technologies. Finally, the unprecedented progress that we have to really bank on and use at the speed of diagnosis, sequencing, and vaccine development. We are blessed to have a vaccine that's developed within 1 year. Otherwise, you can imagine the numbers of lives that would have been lost by coronavirus if the vaccine was not available. Again, simple measures of isolation, masking, distancing, and so on are extremely important. And we now knew that they are more useful than actually only for corona, but other respiratory pathogens. I think with that I conclude. I thank you very much for your attention.
I'm using mic number 2. Oh, you already know which one I'm using. Well, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful presentation. I hope you're all feeling nice and relaxed now. I have to say, I really like that last slide and how the last couple of points, trust in systems. I mean, we've experienced a huge disruption in trust across the world, particularly in the UK. And I think this has brought out the best in human behavior, but also the worst in human behavior. And sound and logical thinking, fortunately, seems to be present in many leaders, but also that seems to have gone out the window as well. I really enjoyed that and learned some interesting things about some of the rocks in our country with little vinegar holes. And you almost said like, MERS, this is our one, like you were proud of it. I feel, I need a virus. In the UK, we haven't got one yet. So I think there's an opportunity for a couple of questions, if anybody has them, or any thoughts. Thank you.
Anybody has a question? May I ask? Can I ask?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Abdurrahman. It was an amazing talk. Given the very high transmissibility rate now of Omicron, it's basically swifting across the globe. Do you think this is calling at the end of this pandemic? By creating natural immunity, of course.
There is a poem in Arabic, النار تأكل بعضها إن لم تجد ما تأكله. The fire will eat itself if it doesn't find anything to eat. So this is basically the same concept. I really don't think so. I think the virus will mutate, will change, will be able to evade immunity again as it did the first time, and we just have to be very, very alert and trying to pick it up early. I really don't want people to feel relaxed. I think the vaccines will be with us. Omicron or coronavirus SARS-2 will be with us for quite some time. This has been thought of initially when people noticed how widespread is the disease. But the focalities of the infections now between countries is a problem. It may have swept in some countries, but others are not. And these will probably be more susceptible to the new mutation coming from Omicron, changing there and then coming back to the other countries. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but this is what we have seen. I mean, over the last 24, 26 months, we have seen the virus really plays with us, mouse and cat. I mean, one strain comes in, Delta was so devastating in the US, they were really extremely concerned about it. And then when Omicron came, hospitals were just closed because of staff being affected by almost 30% of them. And they were changing their isolation criteria, they were calling back to work even if they were infected. And I don't see a reason why it couldn't happen again.
So what's the best possible scenario for this pandemic to end?
I think the best thing is to have as wide coverage vaccine as possible. I really think I'm confident that vaccine is the way to end this, because we have seen how effective it is in certain situations. Whether it's fourth dose, fifth dose, who knows? Now people are working on strain-specific vaccines, which is going to be, again, another development. And thank God for the technology and for the rapidity of manufacturing these vaccines. Imagine if we had to do the vaccines in the old classical way using egg embryos, then we will not be able to match the needs for the vaccines. The graph or the picture from Hopkins shows that more than 10 billion vaccines have been actually distributed or used, which is more than the human population. And producing that number and the logistics of using it and distributing it and storing it is just mind-boggling. But with that, I think it's still worth it, 100%.
I'm going to ask you, oh, no, there's a question over there.
Bismillah. Thank you, Prof. Raji, for this presentation. I really enjoyed it. My concern is about the travel and the quick transportation across the countries. I did not see you stressing on that point, although I think, or at least most of us, they think that travel and quick transportation made a really big change in the epidemiology of this disease. So do you have any ideas about how we control this in the future, the quick transportation, the travel? We now, as you know, we can just travel all over the globe easily in few hours. What is the future of that and the control of future pandemics? Thank you.
This actually has been classical, even during plague or during cholera. Some of us may remember some of the worst cholera seasons. They were related to Hajjis and Hajj going back to their towns. So human movement or travel is an important factor. I think with technology, big data, applications, travel passports and so on, I think we'll be able to hopefully have a better control on that in the future. I really would not be surprised if there is in the future, you have a global identifying number for every person that is, again, has a reference for their vaccine or immunity and exposure And based on that, you will or will not be able to travel or cross borders. I think what we learned, or what we should learn from current COVID-19 is extremely important in terms of, again, the use of limiting transportation or travel, that's restrict about it. We know exactly when it came to Saudi Arabia, with travelers coming from some of the ski resorts or coming from certain pilgrimage areas, and that's where it started. And other countries have the same examples. Can we control it? I think if societies collaborate and they really have the interest and the political well-being to do it, they should be able to do it. It's not really difficult. We have to give something for something. And the freedom of travel is extremely important, and now it is part of the 2021 century life, is to travel as often as you like and as quick as you like. And hopefully with the vaccination, with the programs, we will be able to return to that freedom again.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Right. It's very fascinating lecture, actually. A stupid question. Is there a way using a mega powerful computers and statistical equations to predict the mutation of viruses? And by this way, we can just be one step ahead of any mutation. Thank you.
It's possible. I think the potential outcomes are in the billions. But what we have a better way than this. We have rapid sequencing. We have very quick next generation sequencing. We can actually now, if you have a virus, you can actually identify it within, I would say, literally a few days. So there is no need for the artificial intelligence to predict and come up, because it's so random that it's going to be, I think, in the billions. But once you have surveillance sites, you have the technology available in multiple sentinel positions to pick it up, and then the networking between centers and labs is open and transparent. I think that should be able to pick them up early.
Good, there's one more.
One more question.
Thank you for the nice talk. I just want to ask about the children who are not vaccinated. I'm talking about less than 12 years old. And as we might know that when they started going to school, the Omicron was highly spread, right? And I noticed that the young children, I'm talking about like less than 12 years old, they had really very mild symptoms. They were just like fever, mild fever, just for one day, and then they were in quarantine for 10 days. While the fully vaccinated adults, they faced, more symptoms than the kids. How could we explain that? Because we were just advised to give them the vaccine, but we can see their immunity worked well for that one. So is there anything behind that? And thank you.
It's the virus. The virus has changed to be more virulent towards children because of its genetic composition. Our floors in the first wave in June 2020 and in, I think, September and November 2020, there were 0 children. We had no kids in the floors. We had 220 patients there, all of them are adults. Now they're almost 30% of our in-house admissions are kids because of Omicron. Does the vaccine work? Yes, especially in terms of preventing severe disease. We see them stay for 1 or 2 days and then they're discharged home. I think, as I said, our grandchildren will continue to receive the SARS-2 vaccine. Now, the timing for closure, opening school, and so on, that's different.
Thank you so much, Professor Rajhi, for your elegant talk. Pandemic always generate a lot of questions. It's now my pleasure to introduce our colleague and friend from UK, Professor Luke Howard. Luke works in Summermouth Hospital. He is a professor of pulmonary medicine, Imperial College of Medicine from UK. He will be talking about clinical year review. Thank you, Luke, for coming, and the podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that, and thank you for inviting me. And as you said, we have this expression where you bookend things. You have things that prop your books up. So Saph has bookended the pandemic for me. The last time I was traveling abroad was in 2020 to Riyadh, and here I am now. I managed to dust off my passport and find it somewhere buried under a pile of face masks, and it's great to be here. So I'm going to talk about the year in review, 2021, and so some of this will be fairly familiar to you. I'm not going to go into great detail on each study, simply because that would use up too much time, and I'm going to try to draw a thread or a river run through the talk. So hopefully it doesn't seem that random. These are my disclosures. And I'm going to start off with some new therapies that seem to have come to light in 2021 in phase 2 trials. And of course, the big one that you'll all be familiar with is sotatercept. So what this is aiming to do is to redress the balance of the SMADs. And the SMAD signal the good guys down the BMPR2 pathway, and the bad guys down the activin R2A pathway. And in pulmonary hypertension, even if you don't have a mutation in BMPR2, signaling is reduced through this pathway with less phosphorylation of SMAD158, and there's an imbalance and with more excess of SMAD2/3. Now, what sotatercept does is it mops up the ligands here for the activin R2A receptor, and thus reduces the signaling and the phosphorylation of SMAD2/3, restoring this balance. So this is a very novel therapy, if you like, and it's principally what it says it does, and what I might potentially question is it's an anti-remodeling drug. This is the trial design, so you can see it was about under 100 patients that were randomized 2-to-1, so placebo, sotatercept 0.3 and 0.7 milligrams per kilogram. I think we got the last patient in the UK in the whole study. I begged and begged and begged when they told me it was closed, and they let me squeeze one more in, and boy were they grateful, and I'll show you why. It lasted 24 weeks with the PVR as the primary endpoint, and then there was an extension phase, and now rolling over into Soteria open label. So now the point here with this busy slide is not to go through all of it, you'll be pleased to know, but really to point out that these patients are sick, okay? I pressed the wrong button there. Triple therapy is around 50 to 60%. These are sick patients. Now, they have been diagnosed for about 7 to 8 years, so they're sick but stable. Most of them, 50-50 functional class 2 and 3. And looking at their hemodynamics, the right atrial pressures are around 8, the pulmonary artery pressures are in the mid-50s, and cardiac index is mid-2. So they're sort of intermediate risk, really, with elevated NT-proBNP and walk tests around 400. So they're sick but stable and thoroughly well treated. And this is what was seen and has generated a huge amount of excitement, and I think that's because this is on the background of triple therapy in the majority of patients, with a drop in PVR of 162 up to 260 dynes in the highest group, with a walk distance increase of 50 plus meters, but of course once placebo corrected this only comes out at about 20 to 30 meters. But still, bearing in mind the patient group, this is a relevance. And there were, if you look at some of the other secondary endpoints, we see improvements in NT-proBNP, significantly decreasing, more so in the 0.3 milligram group, and so that was the reason I wanted to put that slide up. In terms of safety, there were obviously quite a few events, but the reason for putting this slide up was that there was one death, and that was in the 0.7 milligram per kilogram group. And they've listed the whole load of excuses in the footnote. You can see it down here. This patient died from a cardiac arrest. Pre-existing risk factors included hypertension, type 2 diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, hyperlipidemia, atrial fibrillation, congestive heart disease, and ischemic heart disease. How this patient had IPAH, I have no idea, but this is what we now say almost as a joke, this is your typical IPAH patient. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I'm going to bring up the changing demographic of patients going into trials. So that's the reason I highlighted that one. This is my patient. She was 33 at the time of diagnosis back in 10 years ago now, and she's never been able to tolerate prostacyclins. She was on dual oral therapy in April 2014, and she trialed nebulized diloprost, also trial of rituximab because she had a strange form of lymphoma. And then in November 2016, she underwent a pulmonary artery denervation as part of a trial, and then she ended up on imatinib as compassionate therapy. She's in functional class 3, walking 320 meters. That's pushing herself absolutely to the limit. High BNP, peak VO2 down at 34%, cardiac index 1.8, and a PVR of 14 Wood units, interestingly coming down by 30% on imatinib. But still, this woman is not transplantable because of her lymphoma, and she is in absolute desperate state. So you can see why I got on my knees to beg them to get her into the trial. Now, she has access to her own BNP data, so when she comes in and she has a blood test, she gets the result. And she sent me an email after the first dose of rituximab, and she said, "Have you seen my BNP result?" I get a tingle down my spine every time I tell this story. So this is her BNP, 1300, one dose, undetectable BNP. This is her cardiopulmonary exercise test after 3 doses. So we continued our normal clinical monitoring through the trial. This wasn't part of the trial. And she has normalized her VE/VCO2 slope. Her peak VO2 is getting up towards normal. And so she's within a couple of doses. She said a couple of days after the first dose, she felt cured. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened for every single patient. We don't know why, particularly. She has been that lucky. And this is what I wanted to do when I said, look, this has been labeled as a drug which has an impact on vascular remodeling. I would challenge, if you see that response a couple of days after treatment, that this is purely vascular remodeling. Clearly, this is affecting the genetics inside the smooth muscle cell, and potentially then having a knock-on effect on vasoconstrictive peptides. So I think there's still a lot more mileage in trying to treat vasoconstriction. But she's an unusual case, but unusual cases teach us an awful lot. So, moving slightly, seems like a bit of a leap, but we'll come back to it because it brings back our case. This is a publication from the Blue Journal this year from my colleagues Chris Rhodes. This has come from Imperial with a validation cohort from Paris. And Chris loves his proteomics. And he's identified these 6 proteins in the blood, in the plasma, which independently of BNP predict risk of death. What he's shown is that if you use the French risk prediction of functional class, walk distance, and NT-proBNP, even within those groups, if you have people who meet those low risk in terms of these 3 parameters, then a low protein score identifies lower risk than the high protein score. So it splits the low risk group. And in the high risk group also. So in other words, if you're high risk if you don't meet these good criteria, the low protein risk score tells you further information. So looking at my patient, and this is her over time, we've got a lot of information here. We've got the PVR, for example, in bright green. That's a nice easy one to spot. And this is sotatercept, and then this is after 6 months. PVR dropping to 5.9. We recathed her a couple of weeks ago. Her mean PA pressure is now 24, having been 60. We've got the PVR there. We've got her walk test in red. And down here, we've got NT-proBNP in purple, the 6-protein model of Chris Rhodes in blue. So we went back all those years and looked at her previous samples, and then the combination of the two. What I find interesting here is that after being treated with imatinib, we see a drop in this protein score, but the NT-proBNP stays high. So clearly, she's still in heart failure, but maybe this is reflecting a pulmonary vascular process in terms of the protein score. We don't have a biomarker for PVR. We just have biomarkers for heart function. So it would be nice if that turns out to be the case. So what about markers that focus on patients? So things like quality of life or activity. So this is a study that's published ahead of print in the Annals of the ATS, looking at actigraphy, something that we're going to be using a lot more with remote monitoring of patients. And we've got step count on the right, and we've got vector magnitude. So this is just how often you wave your arm around or walk in terms of the actigraph. And we can see a correlation between step count or actigraphy and TAPSE, a measure of right ventricular systolic function on echocardiography. We also see how it correlates with your 6-minute walk test in terms of both step counts and actigraphy, and also emphasis 10, which is a UK-derived quality of life questionnaire. 10 questions marked 0 to 5. So the highest mark of 50 is the worst quality of life, and 0 is the best quality of life. So the more you walk, the better your quality of life. And then we produced in the UK a study published in ERJ last year, looking at emphasis 10 as a quality of life questionnaire that in several thousand patients, showing how it correlated with functional class. I mean, if something just correlates with something, then it doesn't necessarily give you much more information, but it's a good validation point, and it's also what the patient feels. So we're getting closer to what the patient feels rather than how breathless you think they are. There's a good correlation between emphasis 10 and 6-minute walk, shuttle walk, and cardiac hemodynamics. It also predicts survival. So we have at the top incident patients, top right, prevalent patients, all patients bottom left, and you can see how the quality of life score, shaded in green, orange, and red, translates into predicting survival. So if you ask somebody a question about how they feel, then this is telling you a lot of information about how well they're going to do. So it's got that double edge to it. And then also showing down here on the bottom right in green how patients who either are low, have good quality of life and maintain it, or have a bad quality of life and then improve it, overall do better than those who don't. And also quality of life can differentiate within functional class. So if you have a functional class 3 patient with a good quality of life, they will survive longer than somebody who has a bad quality of life. And the quality of life and how that changes associates with how much your 6-minute walk distance changes as well. So we've got these violin plots here showing that patients who improve their quality of life by more than 9 points have an increase in 6-minute walk. I'm not sure what that's delta 6-minute walk, that's delta 6-minute walk. This must be instant prevalent patients. I can't quite remember the graphs. There's a danger of doing your slides on the plane. And quality of life seems to go hand in hand with risk stratification. So if you look at these, just want you to look at the top 2 graphs. And what we've got here is if you risk stratify according to the Compera method, so that's all the different measures of right ventricular function, or risk stratify according to Reveal, then in the lower risk group you have in the low risk group, you can see how quality of life maintains its relationship with risk over time, and the same with REVEAL. The point I'm coming to is this nice review by Mark Humbert and Edmund Lau in the Blue Journal that accompanied that paper, saying don't forget the patient perspective. Now we've got lots of we've got lots of quality of life tools. We've got generic ones and we've got pH specific ones. There's the emphasis 10 buried in there. And what this is saying is that actually if you measure a patient's quality of life and how they feel, this relates to their risk of death and their functional status, their exercise capacity. So it's a very important measurement to make, and potentially, therefore, you could even consider it very central to drug development and drug approval. So we tried to do this in the TRACE study. Now, I'm being a bit naughty because this hasn't been published yet. In fact, it's been rejected already by one paper and it's one journal and it's sitting with another. But as the first author, I've got access to all the information, and it's been presented at a number of congresses. So this was looking at selexipag in a phase 4 study, randomized against placebo, with the primary exploratory endpoints of activity using an actigraph and quality of life as an endpoint. Now, there are many things we learned from this. Probably it was too short a study, as by the time you've up-titrated, eventually you've effectively not got very long left of your study. But this is a one-to-one randomization of selexipag against placebo. We're about 100 patients underwent randomization, 108 to be precise, with the majority completing, with more dropouts in the selexipag arm due to side effects. And we saw very little in the way of change. So in terms of non-sedentary activity on the top, only a small increase in the number of minutes. In terms of moderately vigorous physical activity, I think it's safe to say virtually nothing. And in terms of step count, a few hundred more steps on selexipag. And no differences in quality of life either with that, with selexipag. So is it that the drug didn't work? Well, we know from Griffin that it does work. Is it that the endpoint didn't work? Or is it that it's the wrong population of patients? And so that's, you'll remember at the beginning that I said I wanted to talk about populations going into trials. So there's a lot of wordage on here, and the reason I put it in is because I think I couldn't express it better myself, and I'd like to read it out to you. There have been secular and regional changes among PAH trials. So the study, they looked at the inclusion, or the demographics of people going to trials, and this was published ahead of print in the Annals of the ATS. Our findings suggest that PAH study patients are evolving, increasing age at time of study enrollment, and greater proportion of overweight and obese patients, particularly in Western countries. Pre-treatment hemodynamics appear to be less severely affected, so they're milder patients over time, possibly reflecting earlier disease and wider availability of vasodilator therapy or evolution of patients diagnosed with PAH. So these trends differ based on geographic region, particularly for patients in Latin America and Asia, and there is a need for high-quality prospective multi-center registries in these regions to study changes in epidemiology and outcomes. So I thought that was really interesting. Now, these are just some of the graphics showing the differences in region, and what we've got on the top left. So you've got US and Canada in blue, Europe, Australia, Israel in orange, Latin America in grey here, and Asia in red. And this is just the total growth over time, but you can see after this initial bit at the beginning that the proportions are staying roughly the same, except now with more patients from Asia and Latin America, particularly Asia in the last 10 years or so. The proportion of male to female seems to be about the same, which is an important signal. This is the ethnicity, white, Hispanic, black, Asian, and you can see that gradually over time, fewer white patients going into studies, And then this is just the makeup of IPAH versus CTD. And that seems to be fairly constant over time. So what's happening in terms of age? So you've got 4 different colors here, and these represent the different areas you can see on the bottom where the patients come from. And you can see that over time, age is gradually increasing, but you've got significantly younger patients in Latin America and Asia. And surely these patients are going to behave differently. And you would say these are probably your more typical IPAH patients. Looking at body mass index on the top. Whoops, I keep doing that. Body mass index, it's been a long time since I've had to use one of these clickers. I've lost my muscle memory. So you've got body mass index on the top, and then you've got probability of being obese on the bottom. And you can see that this is increasing over time. So there's going to be plenty more comorbidities in trials. And then the entry criteria, hemodynamics. You can see how generally everything is trending down in terms of right atrial pressure, mean PA pressure, wedges staying roughly constant, but still a bit of a drop over time. Cardiac index, I don't know what's going on in Asia, in Latin America. Maybe they just changed the way they measure cardiac index. And then PVR dropping. So patients getting older, milder, more obese, and probably more comorbidities. And so that raises this really fascinating question. Should we be enriching trials more? Potentially, should we be just putting more severe patients in? Now, the problem with that, of course, is if you only put functional class 4 patients in, you're not going to get a license for functional class 2 and 3. So nobody wants to do that. In this study, they looked at Ambition, Seraphim, and Griffin. So Ambition, you'll recall, was upfront dual oral combination. Seraphim was the macitentan trial, and Griffin was the selexipag trial. And they said, right, look, if we risk stratify on the basis of REVEAL, the REVEAL score, and we take, basically, I don't know why they did it like this, but anyway, REVEAL less than 8, yes. REVEAL less than 5, yes, no. And then REVEAL less than 10, yes, no. Why didn't just do the division any other way? I don't know. But anyway, what you can see here is that the greatest number of events occur in the patients with the highest REVEAL score. There's no surprise there. So in other words, if you've got many, many more events, you need fewer patients and you need to recruit for a shorter period of time so you can get your answer much quicker. How many of us have got patients locked in clinical studies over years and years in event-driven trials? And there's a massive competition out there for enrollment into clinical studies. So if what you did, for example, was have 3 different ways of enrolling patients, so you have intermediate and high-risk patients only on the left, or a 50-50 mix of high risk and all other patients, or high risk patients only. And if we just focus on the right, you can see the bar graphs are much higher. This is using the French compare and reveal risk strategies. And what you can see is the sample size reduction increases with the higher risk patients. So in other words, the higher the risk of patients going in, you can reduce the sample size that you study. And also in red, the average treatment time also improves. So this is, as it goes up, there's an improvement in treatment time. So fewer patients, shorter trial duration, earlier answer. But of course, one problem is if you have, if you're screening out higher risk patients, you've got to screen many, many, many more patients, and that's expensive. And it's also disappointing for patients as well. So if you enroll only high-risk patients, for example, then you've got to look at 400 to 800 patients just to get 100 patients in. So you're losing potentially 75 to 87.5% of the patients that you screen. So there's an awful lot of work that goes into that. So on balance, is it still cheaper to do it that way? It's still cheaper. So there's a ratio of screening cost to research cost. Clearly, screening is much cheaper than a whole research study because you just screen them once and then they're out. So looking at these different approaches, you can see how there are still potential net savings And if you screen for high-risk patients only, then you spend a lot more money on screening than you do than if you just bringing out the sort of the lesser risk patients. But overall, you're still saving in terms of money. So that's I thought a really interesting thought, and you know, potentially might even lead to trial failure if you don't put the right patients in. Now, can we do a little bit better with the drugs that we already have available to us? So rituximab was studied by Rohan Zamanian and published last year in the Blue Journal in scleroderma PAH. Rituximab is a B-cell depletion drug, and what he showed was that over the first 6 months, there was an increase in 6-minute walk, not a huge distance, but about 25 meters. Apparently, this is not statistically significant. I don't know why the bars don't cross, but anyway, I'm not a statistician. Over time, if you extended that out, you could see how the 6-minute walk then tailed off after an additional 6 months after the rituximab therapy. But this tailing off seemed to correlate with your B-cell population starting to return. So there's an interesting suggestion in there, and this is placebo here, so no change, 6-minute walk gradually dropping, and the B cells not changing. So suggesting that maybe if you gave another dose of rituximab at 6 months, that might potentially improve your 6-minute walk. But what they also did is said, well, let's look at some biomarkers, so IL-12, IL-17, and rheumatoid factor, and look to see in patients who've got certain levels of these, and we can start to pick out responders. So this is one of the things I wanted to just weave into this whole presentation, is that there are responders and non-responders, and maybe this is how trials are going to develop over time in terms of making sure that we enrich our patients, enrich the studies, in order to establish if there is a true treatment effect in a smaller group of people. What about iron in IPAH? This doesn't get talked about much because it was a dreadful failure, but I'm going to talk about it because it was my study. The study was a success. We did the study, but the study result was negative. And so this was 2 crossover trials in Europe and in China. And the primary endpoint in one of the trials was endurance time, and absolutely nothing happened. And if you look at MRI, NT-proBNP, 6-minute walk, hemodynamics, etc., nothing happened in iron-deficient patients, whether you gave them intravenous iron or not. In terms of PVR, there was also no change whatsoever. So it's good that we do these things. It's disappointing when they're negative because they just get bumped down the journals. So we got bumped down to Annals of ATS, but nonetheless, it's an important negative result. We're brilliant at negative trials in the UK. So this was a study that's published just now, 2022, looking at tocilizumab, which is a rheumatoid arthritis drug, which mops up interleukin-6. What we did was an open label study looking at pulmonary vascular resistance in 19 patients, and this is before and after tocilizumab, absolutely no change whatsoever. Now, the interesting thing about this study is that having done it, we then learnt about this process called Mendelian randomization. So Mendelian randomization, I'm not very good at explaining it, but there are polymorphisms in the interleukin-6 receptor, which lead to different levels of expression of the receptor, and they're quite evenly distributed around the population. So if you have TT or TC and CC, you have different levels of interleukin-6 receptor. If you then go and look at 3,000 patients and work out which of these polymorphisms they have, you see that they all have the same survival. So in other words, if you'd done this first, you'd have thought, we'll never take IL-6 into a clinical, anti-IL-6 into a clinical trial. So that's really cool, I think. I think that's what got it over the line in terms of publication, and it's known when to admit you're wrong and how you could do things better in the future. Now, can we use drugs which we know work? Let's move on from the UK failures to the drugs we know work, and we can perhaps use them a bit better. So, coming back to Selexipag, and we're looking now at the Triton study, which was dual upfront combination therapy against dual upfront triple oral therapy. And you're probably all well aware that this was a negative study. There's a really nice graphic, that's just the demographics. Basically, they're all quite severe. I don't think there was anything else I wanted to say from that. So I'll move on to this nice graphic, which shows you it was about 125 patients in each arm, randomized to triple versus dual therapy. The primary endpoint was pulmonary vascular resistance with absolutely no difference in PVR at 6 months. Secondary endpoints, 55-meter increase in 6-minute walk versus 56, no difference. NT-proBNP dropped by exactly the same in both arms. But there was this interesting little signal here that with initial triple oral therapy, the time to clinical worsening was delayed. So there was this risk reduction. So maybe it's working in a slightly different way, which is why when I talked about Selexipag before, I said, is it, drug didn't work, endpoint didn't work, wrong patients, wrong trial. So there's something in here that's not borne out by the PVR or the 6-minute walk. And something that is also seems to be picking up ahead of steam now is not just looking at time to first event, but of course from a patient's perspective, if you suffer 3 events in 12 months, that's more important than if you suffer 1. So if you add up all the events, then on the right you can see, so it's all disease progression events. You can see that there were 67 versus 31 events, 67 being in double therapy versus 31 in triple combination therapy. So you can start to build a picture that this drug seems to be influencing disease progression more than what you see at the 6-month time point, fitting in with our nice TRACE study yet to be published. Now, so what is the best initial treatment strategy? So here's a really great study from the French group, and I've seen this grow over a period of years at various ATSs and ERSs. And they looked at their 1,600 patients who were initiated on PH therapy, and over time looked at those who were given mono, dual, and triple therapy. Of course, this is not controlled, it's not randomized, and there are many, many confounding factors. So, not unexpectedly, the ones given triple combination therapy, and of course triple combination is going to be with parenteral prostanoids, okay? So intravenous prostacyclin, treprostinil, subcut or IV. So over time, keep doing that, patients get younger, more females, worse functional class, worse hemodynamics and higher risk status. So the sick patients get treated with upfront triple. Now, what happens? If you look at their risk score at baseline on the left and at follow-up, you can see that those given triple therapy have the worst risk profile. Red's always bad, isn't it? And you can see how more of them are turning green, so they go from being the sickest to the fittest. Now, there are still quite a few deaths in there because they are obviously very sick at presentation. So you're converting this group from very ill to well. And if you look at survival, mono and dual oral therapy combine, and triple therapy, this is transplant-free survival, out to here shows an improved survival. So with triple therapy. So, and if you match the patients according to, I can't remember what it was, age, sex, and 6-minute walk, I can't quite remember, but if you match them, you still see this improvement with triple. And what I just want to do is play around with this a little bit and just show you, because we might say, well, clearly IV, therefore, is much better than Selexipag. But if I cut the timelines to exactly the same, so this is up to 2.5 years with the study I've just shown you against Triton, well, maybe it's not so bad. And maybe over time, we'll see Selexipag really start to bring out benefits. Who knows? Now for the weird bit, okay, the strange bit here. So what this is looking at here is that, well, was it the intravenous prostacyclin that was the magic? And the answer is no. The magic is having all 3 drugs together. That's the magic. Because these 2 graphs here have intravenous prostacyclin in them. So green is prostacyclin on its own, blue is in combination with another oral drug, and 3 is all 3 together. Go figure that one out. So, finally, just a couple of slides left if I've got time. I think I have. Are there signs of life in the graveyard of pH trials, that graveyard containing group 2 and group 3 pH? Well, there's some little signs of life which I just want to finish up with. So we've got the SGLT2 inhibitors developed for diabetes, sodium glucose transporter, and I put up 2 studies here. And this study published in, the one on the left is the New England study by Stefan Anker, looking at empagliflozin. I've never had to say that out loud before, just type it. I think that was how you pronounce it. Against placebo, and showing that it reduces death and hospitalization in HFpEF. We're not talking about systolic heart failure here, the one where there's all the treatments out there for. This is the one that the nut we've never been able to crack, okay? HFpEF, so heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, improved survival with empagliflozin. Don't ask me how it works, and I'm not sure anyone really knows. Now, but if you also look at this study in circulation, you can see that empagliflozin reduces pulmonary artery diastolic pressure, which is probably a reflection of the drop in the wedge, as opposed to PVR, and a drop in the mean PA pressure, and now this is in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. So it may be that the improvement in survival is being translated through improvement in RV function. Of course, we would say that because we're pulmonary hypertension doctors. 2 other studies, pirfenidone. I've always wondered why pirfenidone was never used in pulmonary hypertension because of its TGF-beta-centric mode of action. Anyway, it was tried in HFpEF patients, published in Nature Medicine, and showing here that pirfenidone's on the left, placebo on the right. This is the line of identity. So after 12 weeks, just 12 weeks of this pirfenidone agent, patients' extracellular volume on cardiac magnetic resonance dropped below the line. So in other words, there was a reduction in extracellular volume and potentially improving cardiac hemodynamics. And on the right, a weekly infusion of levosimendan, so you administer levosimendan for 24 hours, once a week, over 6 weeks, improved 6-minute walk in patients with pulmonary hypertension related to stiff left ventricle. So an improvement in 6-minute walk by about 30 meters or so. And this graph here just simply shows that there were more people who improved their walk distance who received levosimendan. These patients were screened out by an exercise right heart catheter after 24 hours of levosimendan, showing that their exercise wedge pressure dropped with levosimendan. So you're already selecting out patients who might do better. So some glimmer of hope there. And then finally, my last slide, inhaled treprostinil. I'm only going to put this one slide up because I'm sure it will be covered in detail elsewhere. And this is amazing, isn't it? That finally we're starting to see stuff come through in this really difficult group of PH due to ILD. So significant improvements in 6-minute walk test after 16 weeks of treatment with inhaled iloprost 4 times a day. And it's really important to see other measurements improve alongside and validates it. So for example, and I put this up mainly because look what happens to the NT-proBNP in the placebo group over just 16 weeks. There's a rise of 1,400. So these patients are sick and they're deteriorating. So NT-proBNP improves in the inhaled treprostinil group and there's fewer clinical worsening events. So there's a glimmer of hope there as well. So, conclusion, very short. While you were all looking at COVID, there was an awful lot that happened in 2021 in pulmonary hypertension, and I think very, very exciting times are ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luke, for this elegant wrapping up all the most important studies in 2021. We can now receive questions. Please.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Can put it on, Abdullah. Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I can't stop thinking about the impressive response your patient had, and this leads me to my question. So
I'm really struggling to hear. I think just mainly through the mask.
Take
possibly.
it off.
Oh,
yes.
Sorry. I was saying I can't stop thinking about the impressive response your patient had, and this leads me to my question. So a common saying is one size does not fit all, and yet although they share common hemodynamic profile, we lump all group 1 subtypes when we into one category when we test pH targeted therapy. So my question is it the time now to start looking into the subgroups and study them separately? I'm talking about group 1 because maybe your patient had something related to, I don't know, like the SMAD or whatever signaling pathways are there. So do you think we'll start seeing such trials in the future, targeting specific subgroups of pH therapy?
Yeah, I think the group 3 studies, the phase 3 studies are still unfortunately going to be big because the pharma companies that take them over want to be able to sell as much drug as possible and benefit the broadest population. So they'll hope that over the whole population they'll see benefits and you can apply it. So it's not all about generating money, it's about trying to help the largest population. But I think there's a risk then that we might fail in terms of identifying drugs that work for a smaller group of people. And I think you're right. We do need to at least do an a priori kind of have an a priori agreement that these are the subgroups we're going to look at in advance. So we don't just say, oh, it looked like they did well, let's pull that group out. We have to say in advance that we're going to do this. And I think we need to do it by disease type. So in the tocilizumab study, we saw a signal in connective tissue disease, for example. With the iron study, we cut it. We salami sliced it so many ways, and in the end, we still couldn't find a positive signal anywhere. But I think in terms of molecular phenotyping, that might be even more relevant than disease phenotyping. And I know people like Martin Wilkins, my colleague who works with me at Imperial, says that in 10 or 15 years' time, you won't need any of us to diagnose patients. You'll do it purely on a protein signature. So you might reclassify completely on the basis of a blood test. There's still going to be room for physicians, of course, but that sort of artificial intelligence might help. But also, you might say, I don't care what the diagnosis is, because this signature tells me that this person is going to respond well to this drug. So I think you're absolutely right. That's the direction of travel.
Any more questions? Dr. Amin?
Thank you, Luke, for the nice talk.
Can you take off your mask, please? So
I just want to ask about what do you think about personalized medicine? Would that work better for PH patients in the future? Because this is the future in medicine, right?
So personalized medicine?
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's really where we have to go. And we're developing this concept of the digital twin at Imperial, whereby you can kind of, you can model a patient and model how they're going to progress over time. So looking at genotype, for example, or protein signature, we have to be able to personalize. Although the French study would say, it doesn't matter, just give them all 3 drugs and they'll do well.
Thank you.
But the French aren't here. So
tomorrow
they can't argue.
Tomorrow. Please, go ahead.
Thank you so much. That was a brilliant view. My rheumatology side. So, our trials are having negative results because of they really failed to show us the results, the outcomes, or because of choosing different primary and secondary endpoints. I mean, like we know that in Explorer trials using rituximab and lupus had showed very negative outcomes. But when it comes to reality, even in UK, there are lots of rheumatologists are using it. So with the IL-6, with the tocilizumab and the rituximab, in reality, particularly in scleroderma, we've seen great results. I mean, talking about interstitial lung disease. Is there really any way that we can find other than looking at the 6-minute walking test and the PVR, or are we looking in the right direction, or we need to change our view?
Yeah, so depending on where you think your drug's working, your phase 2 trial, and I once remember hearing the very famous Lou Rubin talking about this, and he said, if your drug is going to work on the pulmonary circulation in phase 2, if you can't show that it drops the pulmonary vascular resistance on the cath, you're done. So, and I firmly believe that's the case. If you've got to show that your drug is doing what you think it's doing in phase 2. But phase 3, then the patient doesn't care what their PVR is. The patient wants to feel better, live longer, walk further. Unfortunately, because of the noise that you get in that, it does mean that potentially things might fail. But actually, what are we in it for? We're in it for the patient. So, but what you're saying is that are there better surrogates that we can get? I think you're right. But I think what we need to do is we need to understand a little bit more. Why does a drug like selexipag not impact 6-minute walk, not impact PVR, yet improve long-term outcomes? Where's the surrogate that we can get that would show us that drug is going to work? Because otherwise, if we'd done the trials that people are doing now, they've gone back to doing 6-minute walk at 24 weeks, selexipag would have never made it to market. So it's a really worrying question, and I don't really have a good answer for you, but I think you've got a very good point.
Thank you.
In line with this question and the previous question, the last 20 years, the focus was on the hemodynamics. And now the Pulsar trial was very impressive when you add something else, targeting something else, like at cellular level now. So don't you think we should focus more now on that, since we have exhausted all this research on the hemodynamics? Now is the time to focus on the gene therapy and immunomodulating therapies, obviously in combination with vasodilator therapy. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think if we were to understand more about the changes in proteins that directly impact on survival, if we understood which ones were truly relevant, then we could be very rapidly looking at, with network analysis, a bit like the question that came over there about using statistical computation to predict the next mutation. We could basically, if we understand the protein changes, and then we've got 1,000 drugs that we can screen, we could probably do it all on a computer. So looking at changes in immune function, and expression of various peptides, etc. Things that I completely don't understand. I'm still living in a world of physiology. Hopefully there will still be a need for me with time, but I think you're right that we can start to do this in a very, very different way as we go forward, and as our ability to understand huge amounts of data and process that gets better. And we can be much more efficient. It's a little bit like looking at that trial enrichment. And if you reduce the number of patients, you can shorten the trial, you can reduce the total number of patients by just including the right ones, and then hopefully we'll be able to get through studies much quicker than taking 6-7 years. How long did it take to produce Griffin from start to finish? Many, many, many years.
Yes. Mustafa? Put the mic on, please. Put the mic on. Yes. It's from above, yes. Up.
Very much. My questions, drugs called Entresto, which is valsartan sacubitril, shows excellent result in heart failure, especially in the reduction of the proBNP. It caused marked reduction in the proBNP and caused excellent remodeling of the left ventricle. Can it be extrapolated for the right side of the heart?
You've got me there. You've got me there. I really don't know. Like pirfenidone, I've always wondered, why not Entresto in pulmonary hypertension? Because, yes, this isn't something that's working on pulmonary vasculature. It's not an afterload reduction drug. This is a heart failure drug. And so I'm not aware of any data on that, but that either it's not there or just I don't know about it. But I wish I did. Thank you for asking the difficult question.
Any more questions? If I may ask the last question before the dinner. I think it's about the time now to start doing a randomized control studies, starting patient on IV mono versus IV double versus triple therapy, and see what happened to these patients. Because Buckley's study, it was very impressive also for patient, how do they do. I remember from Sitbon, the old Sitbon series of 19 cases, how much they nearly normalized their hemodynamics. I don't know why we are delaying such an early intervention, but studying it, to have evidence for that.
Yeah, and interestingly, after that study was published, the one I presented, there was a pro and a con from Hap-Farber on one side, I think, and then somebody else on the other side. And basically saying that exact thing, we need a prospective study. We're getting more and more aggressive over time in our practice, in our unit, in terms of prescribing more upfront intravenous therapy. But one thing I thought I wouldn't have time to touch on, and I wouldn't have done, was the Japanese approach. The Japanese are super aggressive at getting the mean pulmonary artery pressure down to less than 30, I think. I can't remember the precise number. And that is something that's really attracted me for the last 4 or 5 years. I've seen the data. And they're not looking at dropping PVR. They're not looking at normalizing the right ventricle. They're looking at normalizing the hemodynamics. Because you only measure the hemodynamics when somebody's lying flat on a table, not when they're up and about and walking around. And that aggressive afterload reduction is I think, the thing that they're proposing, and I actually agree with it. I think if you normalize RV function, you know you're going to be good for a few years, but if you normalize the PA pressure, you're going to be good for a few decades. And we don't know how best to get there. Ray Benza puts his CardioMEMS devices in. That's one tool that we could use to do that, and it would be a really great adjunct to the study that you're suggesting, that we have this adaptive approach of single, dual, and escalating to try to get that pressure down and seeing what then leads to the best outcomes in future. So who knows, maybe in Saph 2027 we'll be talking about the results.
Okay, I think it is about time now to go for dinner. Thank you so much, Luke, and thank you, Abdurrahman, for your great 2 talks, and thank you for all of you for attending a very interesting couple of talks. Thank you so much. The dinner will be by the pool downstairs. You're all welcome, and we'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Thank you so much.
cheek, cheek. Cheek, cheek. Cheek, 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 cheek. Test. Test, test, test. Test, you want to? Test. Test 1 2. Test, 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 test. Test 1 2. Mic testing. Test, test. 1 2. Test 1 2. Test, 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 test. Test. Test 1 2. Test 1. Check. Mic 1 2. Test. Test 1 2. Test, test. Test, test 1 2. Mic 1 2. Bismillah. Test, test 1 2. Okay now. Test, test 1 2. Yeah. Test, test. Mic 1 2. Order no key. ചെവിയിൽ പറയാനേ. ടെസ്റ്റ്, ടെസ്റ്റ് ക്ലിയർ ആണോ? പുറകിലോ ഇച്ചിരി 4 ടേബിൾ പുറകിൽ പോയൊക്കെ. Jeddah Hilton, Saudi Arabia. My question is test 1 2. Test, 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 test. കേൾക്കണ്ടോ? ക്ലിയർ ആണോ? ടെസ്റ്റ്, test 1 2. Mic 1 1 2 1 2. Ladies and gentlemen. അല്ലാതെ ഇത് ഓക്കെ ചെറിയ റൂമാണല്ലോ.
cheek, cheek one, cheek, cheek one, cheek, 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 cheek one, cheek one. Cheek, cheek one. Cheek one. Cheek one. Cheek one. Cheek, cheek. Cheek one, cheek, cheek. Cheek, cheek one.
कंट्रोल में कंट्रोल में